Well, it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this symposium on media and politics today. We're going to start quite promptly at 2 o'clock because we have to stop at 5 and we want to make the most of the time that we have available. For those of you who weren't able to be at the lectures last week, I should just say a quick word about this visiting professorship scheme and the role of the symposium this afternoon. This is the fourth year that we've had a Humanitas visiting professor of media here in Cambridge, and part of the thinking behind this is that we invite individuals who are not only distinguished scholars of the media, like Manuel Castells, for example, but also active practitioners in the media, that is, people who know the worlds of the media from the inside and are able to speak about them with a great deal of experience. So this year we wanted to focus the visiting professorship on this changing relation between the media and politics. So we were looking for someone who was familiar both with the world of politics and the world of the media. And we're absolutely delighted that Alistair Campbell accepted our invitation. All of you will know who he is. He was Tony Blair's press secretary from 1994 until 2001, when he became Director of Communications and Strategy at Downing Street until he stepped down in 2003. So he is someone who spent a decade at the heart of Westminster politics and was largely responsible for managing the government's relation with the media. Before that, he was a journalist for many years, mainly with the Mirror Group, and mainly a political journalist. So he is someone who knows intimately the worlds both of politics and of the media. He gave us two very stimulating lectures last week on the changing nature of journalism, among other things, and I know many of you will have heard them or will have read them, but for the benefit of those who didn't, I have asked Alistair to give us a very, very brief recap, 5 or 10 minutes at most, of the central arguments of his lectures. But before we do this, let me say something briefly about the format of the symposium. So, the purpose of the symposium is to give us a chance to have a discussion and debate with Alistair in much greater depth than you can achieve in a large lecture hall with hundreds of people. So this is a small group of people, and we'll have a chance to enter into a sustained dialogue and debate. We've divided the afternoon into two parts, and each session will have two speakers. So the first panel will look broadly at the changing relations between the media and politics. And we'll have two speakers, Natalie Fenton and Aaron Davis. I've asked each to speak for about 10 minutes, no more than 15 minutes maximum, and I shall be severe as the chair and will cut them off if it goes any longer. Alistair will then have a chance to respond to their comments and questions, and then we're going to open the discussion for you to participate. We'll stop at 3:30. We'll have a very brief 15-minute tea break. You'll have to hurry and drink your tea, and we'll start again at 3:45. So the second panel will focus more sharply on the changing nature of journalism and the ethics of journalism and the implications of these changes for the relations between politics and the media. And the two speakers for this session will be Angela Phillips and Charlie Beckett. Again, they'll speak for about 10 minutes each. Alistair will respond, and then you will have a chance to participate in the debate. Before we start, let me say something briefly about our first two speakers. Natalie Fenton is Professor of Media and Communications at Goldsmiths and co-director of both the Goldsmiths Leverhulme Media Research Center and the Center for the Study of Global Media and Democracy. She's published extensively on the changing nature of news and journalism, including the well-known book New Media, Old News, and she's actively involved in media reform. She was a founding member of the Media Reform Coalition and is a board director of the campaign group Hacked Off. Aaron Davis is Professor of Political Communication at Goldsmiths. He's done lots of research on political communication at Westminster, on the London Stock Exchange, on political parties and trade unions, and he's written extensively on these and other topics. His many books include Public Relations Democracy, The Mediation of Power, Political Communication and Social Theory, and most recently, Promotional Cultures. And once again, I'd like to thank the Institute for Strategic Dialogue and the Blavatnik Family Foundation for making this symposium and the lectures possible, and especially thank everyone at Crash for all the hard work they put into organising this event. So without further ado, let me hand over to Alistair and ask him to give a very brief recap of his arguments.
Right, if I can remember what they were. Although I have been saying the same thing for many years. Actually, a couple of observations really about having done it, because I found myself, when John first asked me to do this, doing that thing that I normally do when people ask me to do things, right, how do I say no politely, which is my default reaction to most invitations, and then actually starting to use it to think. John very kindly said, he actually just said to me, he says, you didn't actually put a lot more work into this than I thought you would, which was his way of saying that he thought I'd just come along and sort of toss off a few arguments that I've made many times on the after-dinner speaking circuit. But actually, I quite enjoyed thinking more deeply about it than I've done for a long time, because when I was preparing for the Leveson inquiry, which was, quite a big thing, but I was very clear that I was there in a sense to make as big a point as I could, if you like, against journalism. And I found myself, when I was going through this and thinking a little bit about my own past, and both as a journalist and in politics, found myself actually being a bit more sympathetic to a lot of the arguments that good journalists have made about good journalism than I imagined that I would. And one of the things that has, I think, bedeviled this debate the whole way through is the fact that so much of it is conducted on completely dishonest terms. And we've seen a fantastic example of that in relation to the coverage of the Leveson inquiry itself. And in fact, I must admit, I'm usually very good at reading what the press are going to do, but I completely ballsed up last week when I inserted into my speech at the last, sorry, I keep being told I have to say lecture, not speech. I don't know what the difference is, but I've been told I must say that. Into my lecture, and this is not a debate, it's a symposium, okay? So I would never have made an academic, I do know that. But I rewrote the second lecture late on, because the Media Standards Trust were putting out this analysis of the IPSO, the so-called Independent Press Standards Organisation that is the press's rival body to what Leveson is proposing and to the Royal Charter. And they did, I think, a pretty good analysis, and actually I think a very fair analysis, showing the extent to which IPSO is not, to use one of those lovely media phrases, Leveson compliant. And I predicted that this analysis would get 6 paragraphs in The Guardian, I think I said, 2 paragraphs in the Financial Times, and possibly a very brief mention inside another story on the BBC News website. That was my prediction. I was totally wrong. It got no coverage at all, apart from in my speech, and Roy Greenslade, bless him, did a blog. But it actually does show the extent to which it is a completely one-sided debate. One of the points I was trying to make is that if you do believe in journalism being a fundamental pillar of a vibrant, lively democracy, which I still do, then it has to be a journalism that has a commitment to truth, honesty, accuracy, and at least trying to have some sense of balance about an important debate. And this is one debate where I don't think we've had really much balance at all. And we're seeing that not just with those that is called the usual suspects. I saw yesterday there was a huge half a page in The Guardian, the Press Complaints Commission adjudication on a complaint by Christopher Geit from the Buckingham Palace. And when you actually read it, as always with Press Complaints Commission conclusions, the paper just slabs it in there like they do an advert, hoping that nobody will actually read it. And when you did read it, and I really struggled my way through it, it was virtually impossible to work out what the story was about, what they'd got right, what they'd got wrong. And of course that is entirely, this is The Guardian, which is kind of on the side of the angels most of the time on this debate. That was their way of saying, don't read this, it's not important, and yes, move on, and that's what most people do. I suspect I and Sir Christopher himself were probably the only people who struggled our way right to the end, where it finally said, okay, well done, Angela, where it finally said, and therefore the complaint is upheld. And I was left thinking, well, what was the complaint? I've completely forgotten it. So, and that is the way that is the way in which this debate has been conducted. And one of the central points I tried to make was that until we do have a more healthy debate within the media about the media, and I see this as being part of that, because hopefully people do read stuff online and they do sort of at least think about these things, then I think that the press is going to be in a bad state for some time to come. Interesting, with all this talk, and actually again on Snowden and WikiLeaks, I found myself not quite thinking what I thought, because I think sometimes you can have such strongly held opinions, and particularly when you're doing the job that I did for 10 years, it's your job to kind of get out there and say what you think. And then I stepped back, and again I started to see another side to it. I still feel actually that there was a lot of wrong in what Assange did, quite a lot of wrong in what The Guardian and the New York Times have done, but at least I think I saw their point more than I had done before I really thought about it. But interesting, in an era of leaks, whistleblowing and all that stuff, one of the best responses I got to the lectures, both of which are on my website as well as on the website of Crash, but the most followed by the most recent thing I put on my website was something that came to me kind of slightly out of the blue from somebody who works at Mail Online and knows my well-known antipathy to the Daily Mail and all who hopefully one day sink within it, but wrote this very, very interesting piece, which I do recommend to people, about what it's like to work at Mail Online, and it's had a very, very good response, including, I am reliably told by another mole that I have inside there, that they've launched rather a major investigation to try and find out who this person might be. Well, good luck to them not. So, but I thought it was very interesting that was just, within journalism there is that sort of debate going on. And I think I mentioned in the Q&A last week, when I was a journalist on the Daily Mirror, it was pretty well paid, to be absolutely frank, for that time and the age that I was. I mean, not long out of university. And I bumped into a young journalist at the theatre recently who was there working for a tabloid gossip column. And he came over to chat to me and said, you used to work with my dad. And I did. I used to work with this guy, Joe Clancy, on the when I was a freelancer, did shifts on the Daily Star. I discovered I was paid back then exactly the same as she was being paid today. That's 30 years on. You've got people on a national newspaper who are earning the same as I was earning 30 odd years ago. And that whole thing again, I think this is the other thing that made me feel a bit more sympathetic to a lot of journalists. At the top end, you hear about the BBC salaries and the payoffs and all the rest of it. You hear about the kind of, a very, very small number of editors and columnists who are on massive money. An awful lot of journalists actually are earning frankly, a pittance. And one of the most interesting questions last week actually was from Mimi Pakenham, where she said, this is all very well, but what is the model for journalists in the future? And how I said I'd be happy for my children to go into journalism. How are they going to make a living? And I think that is a very, very, very fair question, and there isn't a very clear answer at the moment with all the changes that are going on. Now, I'm just going to sum up by reading literally 2 paragraphs from what I said at the end of the second lecture last week, which was this: it will never be a perfect relationship between state and media, nor should it. But here's why I see grounds for optimism. The second of my lectures was about why, despite all the negativity, despite all the badness in the media, which I set out in both of them, I do see grounds for optimism. The first one was because people are more media savvy, fed up with what they get served up, and that is driving change. And even though people are still buying all the papers I might not want them to, still watching all the television programs I kind of sometimes wish they didn't, nonetheless, I think there is an awful lot of change that is being driven by the public being fed up with what the media serves them up. Secondly, because there will eventually be a new and better system of regulation serving the public, not press or politics, which is how I think it's been before. Thirdly, because the Murdoch-Dacre generation is fading out, and new media and a new generation are eroding their power and influence and democratising our media. Next, because the trends are all towards openness and transparency, and I really do believe that. I think that one of the points I made last week was this nonsense that somehow this Royal Charter or what Leven's proposing is taking us towards a more repressive media environment. I think we have one of the least repressive media environments anywhere in the world. The trends are towards openness and transparency, because however painfully, politics and journalism are adapting to the new age, and I think they are, because they do. And I made the point that when radio came along, it didn't put newspapers out of business. When television came along, it didn't put radio out of business. And I don't believe the internet is going to put all traditional forms of media out of business. They're just all going to have to adapt. And if that adaptation means that some papers you only find online, it doesn't mean that that paper's dead. And I think what the important thing is that we defend and promote and nurture journalism in whichever form that then expresses itself and whichever medium it can thrive. And finally, because politicians can afford to be more strategic. So they were the things that I felt gave me reason for optimism that actually this rather bad era that we've been through can be followed by something hopefully a bit more optimistic, a bit more hopeful, and in which journalism and politics don't get on, because I don't think journalism and politics should get on, but at least can coexist in a way that improves public and political debate. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, and it is a genuine pleasure actually to be here and be responding to Alistair. I can't say enough from a position within the Hacked Off campaign and the Media Reform Coalition how important it is to have people who have a sort of high public profile standing up and willing to be counted in relation to this campaign when you are fighting against the megaphone of a tabloid press saying precisely the opposite and kind of refusing to do responsible reporting over it. It makes an enormous difference. So from that stance, Alistair Campbell, Hugh Grant, one or the other. It's, it really is important. So I think that's fantastic. I want to focus, because John's asked me to focus on the bits that I disagree with most. There's very much of what Alistair says I completely endorse. But there are some questions that maybe he skirted around, some bits that he's missed out, and some bits that maybe I do disagree with that I want to focus on. And I want to kind of respond to it all around this concept of power, essentially, and power within organisations and power also within political culture. And how we begin to address that is, to me, at the heart of this whole debate. And of course, politics can be seen as a game in which the attainment and retention of power is its goal. It's one way of looking at it. Or it can also be seen as a civic forum in which issues and policy proposals are debated and discussed on their merits. Now, political communication will always entail a bit of a fight between those two. It'll be, sort of competitive and civic interests will always be, there and present. But currently there's, I think, a radical imbalance. And politics has been very much, I think, finds itself in a very sordid entanglement, in fact, between governing elites and mediating elites. And actually citizens, which is where Alistair ends up, have really pretty much been squeezed out of the political sphere. And from that, I think we have a corrupted journalistic culture has emerged, and that's actually led to a normalising of a repertoire of quite routine practices. When you listen to the hacking trial, when you tune into that and you say what they're describing is, well, I just thought this was part and parcel of what it was to work in a newsroom. That's is quite shocking and wholly incompatible, really, with the norms of democracy. The two, of course, most pervasive and pernicious of these are character attacks on the one hand, where politicians are targeted through a process of kind of sustained negative characterisation, that kind of toe-curling response around the Blunkett tapes in the recent trial, which was just so desperately cringeable over his alleged affair while you've got Rebecca Brooks and Andy Coulson kind of sitting next to each other, trying not to look each other in the eye, and it kind of just a cringeable moment, really. and attempts to intimidate policymakers who were actually warned then that the pursuit of policies they were elected to carry out will result in media campaigns of vilification. And a lot of the Leveson evidence that was reported gave us very clear indication that that was happening on a fairly regular basis. Now, a lot of this is not necessarily a blanket response to all media, but it doesn't just come out of the Murdoch stable and the tabloids, although they are the most egregious offenders. So I do think that we have something of a crisis in our midst, but I do think we also have to be careful ourselves, and it is quite difficult when you're in the heart of it and you actually get really quite tied up into all the gruesome details. It's not to over-sensationalise that and to give it a more sociological, maybe a deeper critique. And it does fall into a whole background of where news and journalism is right now, with lowest circulation figures we've had in a very long time, advertising migrating to online. We've got kind of a business model that just isn't working, with a rapid increase in free papers, emergence of 24-hour news, etc. We come to what Angela talks about in relation to a much faster and shallower type of news journalism, where you've got much more space to fill and far fewer journalists trying to fill it. Then it's not kind of so surprising that we get the likes of Rebecca Brooks. Doesn't actually have to endorse what goes on. She just becomes part and parcel of what that culture is. But of course, the net result is denigration of the professional life and integrity of news journalists and a detrimental impact on the quality of news and journalism. But that's about that, what happens within the news industry, how it's moved on, how that deregulation, marketisation has led us into a particular situation along with technological change. But we also have something which really is an overarching theme in all of this, which Alistair didn't mention, and that's unchecked media concentration over several decades that's allowed some media groups to accumulate vast amounts of revenue and influence, actually, with adverse consequences. And I think the two problems are intimately linked. Market dominance of news media actually results in an excess of power and unruly political influence that breeds fear. I think we have to tackle that concentration of ownership, that lack of plurality in the news landscape, before we can actually really fundamentally move forward in the positive light that Alistair suggests. So the fear that we get is fear in politicians scared of their careers being wrecked and lives ruined by negative publicity, fear in employees too intimidated to stand up to a bullying culture. It's with great sadness that we within Hacked Off are endlessly trying to get journalists who say to us in private, we fully support everything that you are doing, but I couldn't possibly say so, to actually come out and stand up and be counted. Yet I understand why they won't do it. And so it's again, that is something that you won't tackle unless you actually tackle issues of plurality and concentration. It also leads excessive media concentration to inadequate policing and toothless regulation. Who will challenge the ambitions of News Corp when the stakes are so very high? Well, not many, actually, as we know. And we came very, very close, within a cat's whisker, not so long ago, of allowing the largest and most dominant news company the UK has ever seen to double in size. And you know what? I thought that was going to happen. I thought there was no way in which that could be prevented, and the only way it was prevented was because of pressure brought on them to pull out at the last minute because of the hacking scandal and all the issues around it. Now, the Royal Charter, as much as I support it, won't change that. And if we don't take the opportunity to insist on a minimal level of plurality, to restrict the concentration of ownership, there'll actually be nothing to stop Rupert Murdoch launching a future bid once all of the fuss has died down. Our media system actually has a higher degree of concentration than most other major economies: Germany, USA, Japan. No significant merger or acquisition has been stopped in the last half century, despite the rules that we have. It's all been, well, we'll just ignore it, we'll pass it by. And that's to do with that relationship between politicians and the press. And it's not just concentration, it is also about culture. Stephen Coleman has a very nice piece in which he writes about the first stage in eradicating toxic practices is to define them as being socially unacceptable. I do think that we are at that stage. We've got Leveson, we have all the evidence, we have the courage of victims of press abuse that have done that. The second stage is to demonstrate forcefully that those pursuing such practices won't get away with it. And I think in those terms, a Leveson-compliant, independent self-regulator established under the Royal Charter would do that. It makes the press accountable. But the much more complicated third stage is to counter the Machiavellian ethos that has become banefully entangled in those cultural relationships of political communication. Now that's a relationship, that's a culture that is multi-layered. It's about the frenetic atmosphere of macho newsrooms in which editors pressurise journalists to produce certain types of story, regardless of firm or even sometimes any evidence. It's about backroom meetings in government buildings. It's about party conferences and private clubs in which malicious rumour and menacing threats circulate as a form of noxious currency. So my first question really, and maybe my main question to Alistair, is how do we change that? How do we implement recommendations 82 to 84 of the Leveson report that are looking at the relationship between press and politicians? That hasn't been tackled at all in any of the debates so far. If we don't tackle this, then I think your plea in one of your lectures that people should get into politics, so you should ignore Russell Brand, get involved and vote, otherwise change will never happen. I think unless we change that sordid entanglement between governing and mediating elites, we'll ever more choke any trust or hope from people coming to vote in the system of democracy that they're faced with. So if we're looking at those recommendations, should political leaders, as Leveson suggests, set out an explanation of the approach they propose to take as a matter of party policy in conducting relationships with the press? Can they do that? Can each party political leader set out, well, this is the approach I'm going to take? Is it possible to do that one party at a time? Or does that have to be tackled on a much broader basis? And it would seem to me in some ways a no-brainer that recommendation 83A, which requests a simple register of party leaders, ministers and front bench opposition spokesmen's long-term relationships with media proprietors, newspaper editors or senior executives, be published. All those things being the godfather of Murdoch's children, attending the weddings, doing this. Those sorts of long-term relationships are published. But would that have captured certain of the relationships? Would that have told us about the relationship between Andy Coulson and Rebecca Brooks? Does that matter? Again, I think questions that we need to answer. So yes, I think transparency and accountability are clearly key. I do think the Royal Charter helps us, but I still think we have some way to go. The philosopher Baroness Honora O'Neill actually has a very interesting approach, and she talks about accessibility, the need for communication to be accessible between the two parties, who's the person trying to communicate and the person they're trying to communicate to. And she says that this can be secured by limited regulation of media process combined with prohibition on any censorship of media content. And I was interested, Alice, in what you said at the end of your introduction, that you'd shifted your position on Snowden, because it did seem to me to be something of a contradiction in your argument, that you were in many ways kind of siding with the spin of secret services in that sense that you weren't really willing to let go of that political control over prior restraint of content. And where does that leave us? How do we juggle with that argument? And I think it's a real problem. I think it's a major issue for all of the things we're tackling over news at the moment. What do we mean when we talk about censorship in those issues, and how do we deal with that? So I think, yes, we need more openness about communication. I think there's lots of things that we can and should do as the Royal Charter rolls out, and maybe as the new Code of Standards develops. We should be thinking also as civil society, as general public, as audiences and readers. Maybe we need more openness than even is in that right now. Without doubt, however, and this is where I will end, media concentration creates conditions in which wealthy individuals can amass great social and political power. Rupert Murdoch's and family were recently positioned at number 33 of Forbes magazine's list of the world's most powerful people, with a net worth of $13.4 billion. Just 3 companies control nearly 70% of national newspaper circulation, while only 5 groups control more than 70% of online news consumption when you measure it by browsing time. Large sections of the British media, and really please, if you haven't yet, go in and dip back into that Leveson evidence, because it's the most fantastic archive of material. You will see British media are simply too close to powerful vested interests. If we want a media that's free to hold power to account, we need then a full and open debate on media ownership and media pluralism. But we need to go further. We need remedies to loosen the grip on the national conversation exercised by the most powerful media organisations. Ownership thresholds, market caps, public interest obligations, creative interventions to stimulate new journalistic voices. Where do you stand on those, Alistair?
Okay, thank you for your presentations, Alistair, which I was going over this morning, much of which I broadly agreed with. Personally, I've researched both sides of the equation, journalism and politics, over many years. Today I'm leaning on your political side, on your post-journalism career, and asking difficult questions about the actions of parties in relation to contemporary crises of how we perceive formal politics and how political media relations may have fed into that. So I'm going to kind of cover 5 quick topics and ask you 5 difficult questions of varying degrees of difficulty. First is just to talk about the issue of crisis in formal politics, because although we're not here in the UK in the situation of Greece, let alone Syria or Egypt, we don't have a Tahrir Square in evidence. There's still a long-term problem with the crisis of politics. And that long-term crisis can be seen in simple figures in terms of our slowly declining levels of voting, hovers around the low 60s on average in the recent elections. Members of parties have dropped to probably about 1% of the country now, from being several million some decades ago to being a few 100,000. Public faith in politicians to tell the truth, again, has been pretty low. At the height of the expensive scandal, only 13% of the public in the UK trusted politicians to tell the truth. Politicians regularly float along the bottom of these who do you trust polls, below journalists. Fortunately for investment bankers and estate agents, they're not in these polls, or they might be below you. But the issue is whether or not we have faith in, whether or not the public has faith in political parties anymore. There seem to be a whole series of issues, from global financial power and instability, growing inequality, environmental issues, natural resource squeezes, and so on, that parties don't seem to be able to deal with. If you go along, read the prolific, wide-ranging literature about the crisis in politics, people blame all sorts of actors and institutions. Some deny we have a real problem. It's just public apathy in general. But many try and pick on various things, these global issues, this hollowing out from below and above of politics. Some of them point just to parties. It's parties and what they've become and how they've changed as part of the problem. So that takes me to my first question, which is it parties? Can parties, is it within their remit to arrest this decline, this downward trajectory? Or is it beyond them? Is it these other things? Could parties change the way politics actually happens? My second issue is a bit more focused, and it's focused on this issue of professionalisation. Because the history of parties, when there are several written in the UK and elsewhere dwell on the transition of what a political party was and what it's become. And what it was much more about localized politics, it was much more about ideologies, natural constituent groups in society, the committed amateur, committed activist. And what it's moved to is this highly professionalized, centralized, funder-driven, promotionally driven, media-driven party with many professionals a part of that. And it's moved away from what many people felt was the kind of party that they were once a part of. So we have journalists, we have media experts, we have polling experts moving in to parties. And of course, you were one of those many people who came in and were part of the professionalization of parties. And on the one hand, professionalization is good. All organizations need to be professionalized. Politics need to be professionalized. Policy, consulting, communicating with voters all needs professionalization. On the other, there are these various consequences, one of which revolves around this media presentation. And you talked in your talk about Merkel still surviving in an era of Obamas and Blairs and so on. But you also see when you look across that often the Blairs beat the Browns, the Bushes beat the Gores and the Kerrys, and so on and so forth. And it's likely, or it's a good chance, that the Cameron will beat the Ed Miliband, purely on the ability to present oneself in the media. And I know Ed Miliband has a professionalized history as well, but in terms of his presentation, can he win through? So is it really possible for the better political leader to win through in the modern age? Now everything has changed. Though some people might disagree whether Ed Miliband's a better political leader or not. But is it possible for the weaker media performer to win through? The third issue follows on from these points, and that is about parties of the left specifically. Because a lot of the professionalization has also seemed to come with success towards more centre-ground or right-leaning parties, moving politics in the UK and the US towards the right. Tony Blair was obviously the most successful Labour leader at winning elections, but also many regard him as the more centre-ground, centre-right political leader. The big difference with Tony Blair was he persuaded the left to go with him as he moved to the right. Cameron persuaded the left and the centre ground to go with him and then move to the right as well. So it's this movement to the right, and that leads to my third question, which is, can a party truly of the left be truly modernised and professional and still win out? Is there hope for an Ed who is truly red? Is my third question. The fourth issue is about spin and media relations. Many people regard New Labour as the era of modern media management, modern spin. Well, having looked at it over the years, it's fairly obvious it was the Thatcher years that brought in the Shanwicks and the Saatchi and Saatchis and the Tim Bells and the real systematisation of spin and media management. But clearly New Labour brought in other elements. They moved that machine along. They smoothed it out. They smoothed out the rough. They honed that machine. And at times, when the party felt it needed to, it put that machine to powerful use. Changing Clause 4, the war in Iraq, and so on and so forth. But it was held for certain times. But if we look at today's coalition party, the likes of Cameron, Gove, Lansley, IDS, Pickles, Hunt, they use that machine on a daily basis. It doesn't matter the facts, the figures, the truths, the realities. We have this machine that tells us that we don't have privatization, we don't have massive health cuts, we don't have genuine welfare claims, we don't have valid immigration, and so on and so forth. But of course, many of the facts and figures say otherwise, and yes, we do. And I would say, of course we do on all these things. So my fourth question is, do you regret the honing of that machine, which now has found its way into the hands of such people who can say whatever and be accepted? And my last question, my last issue, you only had a very small part, but I can't put that all. My last question is about journalist-source relations and conflict, which I think is much of the theme of today. It was my PhD. I was looking at this very topic of media, public relations, and sources and their relationships through the 90s. And I'm not going to ask you many questions. I would have loved to have asked you if I could ever got to interview you at the time. But when I was asked to come and speak today and I thought about you, the first thing that popped into my mind was an interview with Michael White in the 1990s, who, apart from telling me how I couldn't take notes properly and that academics were a waste of time, he then went into great detail during the interview about how he won a fight with you. And what I really want to know is who did win that fight. And if he was here now, who would win a fight now?
Right. How many people were aware that I'd had a fight with Michael White? A small handful, yeah. I'll come on to that. Right, where do I start with that? It was all quite tricky, really. First of all, I want to start by, Natalie, reading you a sentence from Lecture 2. As I said yesterday, this can only be done by the next generation. This is one of my biggest reasons for optimism. The Murdoch-Dacre generation has had its day. You do not need to have a master's in corporate history to suggest that the post-Murdoch era will lead to substantial change in his companies. Politicians who've been so reluctant to tackle standards might then see, as the empire moves and separates in different directions, that the real issue, ducked by successive governments, is ownership. So I do agree with you on that, and I do agree with your analysis that it's something that politicians have just decided, in a sense, to ignore, even though they were aware that it was, if you like, a real problem. And actually, there's a theme that I think links both sets of questions and the points that you made, and that is, you called it the kind of this sordid entanglement between governing elite and mediating elite. And then if you get onto Aaron's more kind of Labour-rooted analysis of why we did what we did and why the media became like it's become, I think you do, particularly if you're on the left, but I think if you're just generally analysing this, you have to come from the realistic standpoint that successive Labour parties and successive Labour leaders have had inflicted upon them substantial political damage because of an inbuilt right-wing bias within the media, a bias that still exists. So, for example, to take one of Aaron's questions about do I regret the honing of the machine so that today's generation of politics can frankly say what they like and get away with it, I don't regret the honing of the machine. I do regret a media that allows them to do that. We couldn't get away with those things, either when we'd honed the machine, and certainly not before we'd honed the machine. Or if you look at just look at the difference, and yes, there were all sorts of controversial issues that are attached to this. Look at the difference in the coverage, say, of Tony Blair and the money that he makes now as a former Prime Minister, and John Major, who is treated like something of a national treasure, who makes he does an annual Andrew Marr show appearance, makes the occasional speech to remind people he's still around and tweak a few tails, and then he goes off back to the Carlyle Group or whichever it is that he works for, and nobody bats an eyelid. Look at the difference between the way the spouses of Labour Prime Ministers and Tory Prime Ministers are treated, where, and I'm not complaining about Samantha Cameron not being treated aggressively, but compare it with the way that, say, Cherie was, or the way that at times Sarah was, and then go back to Norma Major, who could write a book about Chequers, and did anybody ever bother about what was happening to the proceeds and the profits and the rest of it? Cherie couldn't go for a walk to the shops without there being somebody out there trying to suggest that there was some sort of terrible underhand thing going on. So my point is, we had to make a lot of these changes, I think, to deal with this bias. Now the question then is whether, in so doing, we compromised on any of the political principles to which we we held then and continue to hold. And the only area where I think actually we would have to put our hands up and say yes we did was in relation to this area of media management and media ownership. I don't think, for example, in relation to something like Europe, I mean, the fact is that Tony Blair, very pro-European, even despite all the kind of opposition that there is now, would still classify himself as a big pro-European. Most of the media passionately against Europe, and that doesn't mean the public are. But did we change our position on Europe? No. We changed occasionally our tactical management of the newspaper groups and some of their key figures, but I don't think we ever sacrificed, as it were, our fundamental policy position. If you are, this is the reason why I think it's wrong to go back to one of Aaron's points about what you talked about, the professionalisation of the politics. Is it possible for the weaker media performer to win through? I think here you kind of do have to trust the public to get to the point over time. When it came, I mean, it's really interesting this, the day before John Smith died in 1994, if you'd have conducted a survey of most opinion formers within the Labour Party and said to them, if John Smith died tomorrow, who would take over? The vast majority would have said Gordon Brown, because actually they didn't have to think about it. When John Smith died, they had to think about it, and it gave a completely different answer. And it wasn't actually about who at that time was thought to be the stronger or weaker media performer. It was a broader judgment that people then required to make a decision made in a completely different way than they would make that decision if they're being asked a question in an opinion poll. And I think it's the same with the public. I think yes, you'll get some people who will vote based upon some ridiculous, inaccurate story that's in the Daily Express or the Daily Star or anywhere else. But by and large, those who vote, and I'll come on to the problem about those who don't, but those who vote tend to reflect a what I would define as a kind of popular wisdom that is worked out over time. If you go back to every election since the Second World War, so there's Winston Churchill. If I ask most people in this room now to say who was Britain's greatest ever Prime Minister, most people would say Winston Churchill. The same way as in America, most people say Lincoln was the greatest ever president. That's the way history works. It just kind of layer upon layer upon layer, and eventually you have an accepted judgment. Well, what was the accepted judgment of the British people in the first election after Winston Churchill's greatest triumph? It was to kick him out. Why did they decide to do that? Because in their popular wisdom, they had decided that actually the amazing job that he did as a war leader and the qualities required to do that were not the qualities that were now required to rebuild the nation after war. So we'll get that nice bald chap in who doesn't say very much. I mean, Attlee famously was actually, on the day he called an election, goes out for a walk at lunchtime, as he regularly did, bumps into a reporter from the Times. This is on election day, the day the election is called, and the reporter says, is there anything you'd like to say to the nation as we go into the general election? And he sort of looked at him and said, no, and carried on. Now, you can't imagine that today, but actually, if you look at, so was he a weak or strong media performer? I know that wasn't the media age, but you know, it was always sort of part of this sordid entanglement always went on at greater or lesser degrees. So he gets in for a few years. I often think about Ted Heath. You look at Ted Heath and you think, that guy is not a classic looking modern politician. His life is not a classic modern politician's life. So what was his purpose? His purpose was to be the only Conservative who could possibly have persuaded the country to vote yes in a referendum and go into the European Union. And that's what happened. And that was that was the single most important historic step of that political generation. And then you had this sort of, you know, Harold Wilson winning lots of elections, but never quite sort of being one of the big sort of change-making leaders. Then the country goes through the whole thing with the trade unions, winter of discontent, blah, blah, blah. And along comes Thatcher. And the country sort of just decided that the sort of kick up the arse you wanted to give the country was what the country needed. And, you know, whether you're on the left as I am or you're on the right as all her supporters are, there's kind of, you can sort of see the wisdom of that. And then Neil Kinnock was leader, and was he a weak media performer? Well, he was savaged by the media, but actually, to some degree, that was what also gave him a strength in terms of what he could communicate to the public. And I think that what happens is the public sort of get to a reality. So if you take the current political situation, and it's entirely possible that Cameron could beat Ed Miliband. It's equally entirely possible that Ed Miliband can beat David Cameron. And their performers to use your word, as media figures, will be part of the judgment that people make. But it's only a part of it. It's been very, very interesting to me to see in the last few weeks that I think the judgment around Ed Miliband is, I mean, you look, loads of people just come up and talk to me the whole time, and you hear regularly people saying, you picked the wrong brother, Ed Miliband, I can't imagine Ed Miliband in Downing Street, can you imagine him standing up against Vladimir Putin, da, da, da. But actually, I'm finding that fewer and fewer are saying that, and more people are saying, you know, I liked what he did on energy, or at least he stood up to Murdoch. And, you know, there are layers that you can build and build and build and build. And then you get to a general election, and all that stuff sort of weighs into people's minds, and they'll make a judgment. And I think, what I think is fascinating about politics at the moment is I can imagine, normally I can predict an election. In fact, this is not being boastful, because Philip Gould, when he was dying, he did a revised version of his book, The Unfinished Revolution, in which he revealed that I said I think it was 11 or 9 months from the last election, this election is going to be a coalition government with the Tories and the Lib Dems. And the reason I thought that was because that was the logic of what everybody that you heard talking about politics was saying. Fed up with Labour, don't want them back, not sure about this Cameron guy. That's what everywhere you went, you were getting those two messages. So there's only one way to reconcile those messages, and that's to do what the public did at the last election, which was to make it a bit confusing, get the politicians to sort it out. The guy with the biggest numbers wins, and he takes into the guy who's third. And that's what happened. And I think a similar thing may happen next time. And my point is the media performance is less important. This may be wishful thinking, okay? Because I accept that technically Cameron is quite a good communicator. However, I think his strength as a communicator has become an illustration of one of his really big weaknesses, because he's actually lacking in strategy. He's lacking in a clear understanding that he's the most powerful person in the country. He can use that power to effect change, and he doesn't quite know how to do it. So instead, he pops up on the news. I don't know if you watch this with Cameron. He's on the news every single night. And he's on there talking with identical body language and with identical levels of passion about an issue that he cares really, really deeply about, and he's not going to rest until this is done. Okay? And it's always a different thing from what it was the day before. And of course, strategy is where you appear less often, but when you do, you're saying and doing and promoting the same thing. So I think you can be what is technically described as the weaker media performer. It helps if you're good on the media. You see, I think when I mentioned Obama jury out, okay, because he's still there, I think Tony Blair and Bill Clinton, because they were both good communicators, I think in reputational terms that became something of a problem for them, because it stopped people seeing, I mean, Clinton, for example, Clinton is an amazing sort of policy detail merchant. He can bore the backside off anybody with every job creation program anywhere in the world. But because he was such a good communicator, people think, oh, he's just a slick front guy. They thought a little bit about the same with Tony, but actually both of them were very good decision makers. And that ultimately is much, much more important. And I think there's a danger that we focus too much on how politicians come over, what they wear, how they look, and all the rest of it. The reason I quoted Merkel in that first, or I can't remember which one it was now, one of the lectures, why I quoted her is because I think she's not an identikit politician. She was also the better media performer because the substance was what mattered. And both of you really were saying, how do you kind of rebuild trust in politics, faith in politics, engagement in politics? Part of the problem here, I think, is just the sort of, I think when you're not going through, you're right to say we're not going through a sort of existential crisis in the way that, say, Greece is or some of the countries in the Middle East are. And I think that does breed an extraordinary amount of complacency. And one of the things that I put in the speech last week that I was a little bit worried about saying, because it sounds sort of arrogant in a way, but I do think that my parents' generation did have a much greater sense of responsibility on themselves to become informed. And I think we've just become very, very complacent. And the other thing is that I think politicians and media are both scared actually to challenge the public over their own conduct and their own behaviour. The public are always right. Well, the public are not always right. Any member of the public who says, I care more about voting in X Factor or I'm a celebrity get me out of here, than they do in voting in a local or general election, that to me is somebody who has to be challenged rather than patted on the head and told you're you're right about everything. They're not right. And I think we've got to elevate the debate on this, both politics and media, away from the sordid entanglement. And I think the sordid entanglement is disentangling a little bit. But if you read any history book, read any account of anybody's political life, including Abraham Lincoln, who is sort of now revered as something of a saint, you have to have at least relationships with media that allow you to communicate your message to people who you're not going to meet. And that's the vast majority of the population. And the great thing about the way that social media is proliferating, the great thing about the way that these old media oligarchs are kind of fading and breaking down, and I think it's going to happen more quickly than they or we think. I really do. I know, again, this is partly wishful thinking. I'd love it if they could all sort of lose their power and influence and the rest of it. But I do think it's happening quickly because I think people are more aware of it. But aware of what they do, and I think that social media is giving everybody the chance at least to have a voice. A lot of the stuff that you've done, Hacked Off, because the press, for obvious reasons, don't particularly want to cover it, here's an interesting thing they did. Because Hugh Grant's a very well-known film star, because Steve Coogan's a very well-known TV star and the rest of it, they very successfully put two and two together and basically said, this is all about celebrities. It's one of the big lies that I put in the thing last week, when actually they've created a media landscape where unless you have a celebrity attached to a cause, the cause is not going to get the profile. I made the point about, it's really frustrating. I know this in the charitable stuff that I do. We had a mental health thing. We had recently Newsnight. I was doing something about alcohol abuse, and they said, we just want to talk to, all quotes, ordinary alcoholics, was what they said, ordinary alcoholics. To which I said, great, it means one fewer interview that I don't have to do. And that was fine. On the day that this thing was meant to be happening, they changed their mind. Why did they change their mind? They changed their mind because they wanted to have a not ordinary alcoholic, and that was deemed to be me. So I have to go out and do another thing. So and I made the point, Angela Jolie, she turns up anywhere in the world, talk about any issue. William Hague, I'm not criticising him for this. he had this whole thing about female genital mutilation. He wanted to do a big campaign on it. That's great. Male foreign secretary of a major country like Britain wants to do that. He had to take Angelina Jolie, otherwise nobody was going to go on the trip, nobody was going to cover it, and nobody would care less. That's a difficult situation in which to be. So I think this is, in answer to your, I don't know if that's professionalisation or not. I'm just going to whiz through this now because I can see John's getting agitated. Can parties arrest the downward decline? Yes, but only if they understand it's like you have to admit a little and move on a lot. And I think, yes, we can all admit, as Ed has done, politics and media got too close. Yes, we can all admit we have to modernise, we have to change, we have to reach out more. But I think both media and politics have to do a better job, actually, of telling the truth about their consumers. I said in one of the lectures, totally, one of the few things Tony and I disagreed about, I think we should have compulsory voting, we should have education about politics and media in schools from a very, very early age, because it is part of everybody's life, and as long as you've got none of the above, and Russell Brand can have his little cross, but I do think unless we have that, and we have an understanding in people from young children, politics matters. You can like it or dislike it, but it matters to every single one of us. Is it possible for the Wikimedia Forum, I've done that one, can a party of the left be modernised and still win, and could Ed still be read and win? The answer is yes. But ultimately, you see, I don't think Ed's Miliband political positioning is driven out of polling, focus groups and all the rest of it. I think he kind of is what he is. And what's different, the only difference between him and being just a sort of ordinary backbench MP is the extent of the profile and the focus. If he came out with stuff that was sort of totally off the wall, I don't think he's come out with anything that's totally off the wall, but if he did, the Tories tried to say his energy thing was Marxist, and he rebutted that. He didn't rebut it because he didn't want to be called a Marxist, even though when he went out and defended his dad and all the rest of it, he rebutted it because it wasn't true. And therefore, I think he was putting over a truthful position and then trying to communicate it in a concerted, strategic way. And, I see him from time to time. He now needs three or four more of those sorts of, because you only get cut through in the debate if you do policy. You're never going to get cut through just by looking nice and looking good and being good on telly. Because I think that's, as I say, I think that's Cameron's weakness. He doesn't get cut through on policy. Do I regret honing? I've done that one. I'll come back to the fight. I think I should finish with the fight. Natalie, I sort of found myself, I sort of felt she was trying to disagree with me, but she didn't really. The first thing is, I think you're wrong about, I think I'm right, you know better than I do. Wasn't David Sullivan blocked from buying the Bristol Evening Post papers? And that was, I think, on the grounds of not being a fit and proper person. So Richard Desmond obviously is, because the crime was pornography. And I think I'm right, that was the one time it's been used. But on your general point...
It wasn't a monopoly.
Bristol Evening Post, not a major paper, says Media Guru. No, it's true. And what's more, I think these sort of... There aren't that many of these kind of big takeovers that come along. When they do, I think they do get put into a box that is marked, let's just hope it goes away kind of thing, because it's not on any government's core priority. When they're talking about economy, public service and all that stuff, you know you're going to get disproportionate focus, political grief out of it because it's a media issue, and the media are always very good at covering their own vested interests. So certainly I think there were probably, I can't think of any that specifically come to mind, but I'm sure there were points at which had we been analysing it as an industry that didn't have the profile that the media does, I'm sure we would have done more than we did. I don't think there's any doubt about that at all. I can't think of any specifics. I do remember at one point Tony Blair made, I can't remember if it was a speech, I think it was a speech, and it didn't get much coverage, doubtless because there was something else in it. And it wasn't the Feral Beast speech, which he made way too many years too late. He made a speech where he basically talked about, he wanted a liberal media marketplace because we wanted to encourage foreign owners, by which we did not mean Rupert Murdoch, we meant some of the sort of, I think, better European media owners who are in the continental Europe, who actually do see themselves as being, if you like, investors in journalism. And we got the Americans, and it didn't happen. But that's what he was. The reason why he was saying, there was a specific bid on. It was to do with Murdoch, but I can't remember what it was. But I remember him being out saying, actually, we need Germans, we need French, we need Italians, preferably not Berlusconi, and we need them coming in and understand. And you're only going to get that if you've got a liberal media marketplace. Now, the people who exploited that liberal media marketplace are, with Angela pulling one of those faces, she's right, Rupert Murdoch. On the point about, I agree with all your stuff at the end, by the way. You may think I disagree, but I want all that stuff of more, that's why I mentioned last week the whole kind of, whether it's No More Page 3, everyday sexism, the smaller platforms, the more they can be supported and developed and become part of the media marketplace, the better. But I don't think you'll ever get rid of some element of the sordid entanglement. Wonderful phrase. It's 5 times I've used it now. And what's more, I'm not sure you ever should. I don't have any problem with total transparency about who you see and when you see them, but it shouldn't just be about the media. I noticed on Twitter yesterday, Pierre Moscovici, the French finance minister, he tweets his diary. That's quite interesting. I know the American president, they published the president's diary as a public document. Now, there is a downside to that. There is a downside to that, which is that you sometimes maybe don't have meetings that you should because you're worried about that sense of the need for transparency. Would we have had some of the meetings that we had with members of the IRA at the times that we did? There has to be, this is back to Snowden I guess now, there has to be within the public policy making space some space, I think, for secrecy. There has to be some space for politicians and other policymakers to be able to make policy in a way that doesn't have the microscope shone upon every single part of the policy process. Now, how you get that balance right, that is, I guess, where the Snowden debate is taking place. And that's why I think at the moment it's too kind of binary. You either can't publish any of that stuff or you have to publish it all. I think there has to be some kind of mechanism and some kind of dialogue that goes on to give you a sort of halfway house. And also, I think you've just got to be realistic about politicians. You talked about whether politics is a game and the goal of the game is the gaining and retention of power. Well, that is, if you change the word of game to purpose and mission and an understanding that without power you can do absolutely nothing, then I think you maybe have a different take on it. In other words, this is back to the politicians needing to do a better job in defending what they do. There is nothing wrong in politicians wanting to have power, nor is there anything wrong in them wanting to get their message through to the public, because ultimately the public will decide whether they get into power or not. And one of the vehicles for that is the media. And having the ability to get your message into the media is an important part of gaining power. Less important once you're in power, as Angela Merkel has found, because then actually what you do is far more important. But I think that I think we just have to be a bit more grown up about this. And I concluded my lecture last week by saying there has to be a more grown up mutual respect between the, if you like, the revealing classes, the media, and the governing classes, politicians, who I think have a legitimate desire to want to be heard and to want to win support of the public, because otherwise, what's the point of it all? Totally agree with what you said about character assassination. I've had a few of those myself, but actually I think I'm a very good example of how much you can survive. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. It really, really doesn't matter. This is what I try to say to the politicians all the time. I mean, it's like if the Daily Mail ever said anything nice about me, I would cringe. I'd want to sort of dig a hole and jump into it. What do you mean?
Just go ahead and finish, and I'm going to give them a chance to...
Okay. No, I finished.
Just stay there for a minute. Now.
Okay.
So, we'll ask Natalie and Erin if you want to have one question in response.
Oh, I haven't answered who won the fight.
No, wait. If there's one thing you'd like to say it, and then I'm going to open for questions.
Go on, one thing that's
You don't have to.
cool.
You don't have to.
Okay, no, I'm going to
You're
wait
right.
because
You're
there are
right.
so
Okay.
many things
All right.
I would
All
like to
right. All
talk
right.
to Alistair about.
Then at that point, let's open to questions from the floor. Sure, go ahead.
I just want to talk about
Keep your questions very concise, if you would, because we haven't got much time.
Okay.
So be very, very concise.
I just want to talk about political apathy. I don't think there is an apathy problem, but I think people, especially younger people, are interested in a different kind of politics, and politics of an issue. How would you seek to bring the politics of an issue, and how would you advise Ed Miliband to really connect with issue-based politics?
I totally agree with your analysis, by the way. I think this kind of middle-aged and above assumption that young people aren't interested in politics is just wrong. I mean, I've got 3 kids, two in their 20s now, and one who's just gone to university. And, I mean, obviously they've grown up in a political family, but their friends haven't. And my sense is if you expose any young person, that's why I would lower the voting age as well, by the way. I think if you expose any young person to the reality of political debate, they get into it. But as you say, they don't do what maybe my generation did, which was associate yourself almost tribally with a political party. And this comes back to the challenge to the politicians to make politics more interesting and more relevant. Now, part of the irrelevance is the sense that if you vote for a party, you've got to sign up to the whole package. Well, that requires politicians actually to do a better job of explaining the process and understanding, though, it's like whenever somebody votes for a Labour MP, they're voting for that MP who's standing on a manifesto. They're actually voting for that person to go and do a job of work in helping them, the government, if they become the government, to implement that programme. But within that, you have mavericks, you have critics, you have rebels, and that's exactly as it should be. But it goes back to the need for all of us just to be a bit more honest about the way things work and why we think they should work like that. Because this was the great weakness of Russell Brand's interview with Jeremy Paxman, was when Jeremy Paxman says, well, fine, okay, but what do you put in place of government? Do we not have a government? And Russell Brand said, well, you can have a government, but call them admin bods. You don't need to call them a government. And he sort of, at that point, it just sort of fell apart and all became a little bit silly. And actually, he'd made some really, really, really powerful points about apathy. But the other thing is, you take something like a football match, okay? When there is a football match on the television, the media sees it as its job to make people interested in this, okay? When there is a political debate, it's almost as if the media sees its job as to make people cynical and disinterested in this. And if they could just take a little bit of that tone and that, if you like, political body language vis-a-vis politics as they do on sport, I think we'd all be in a better place. In the 2001 election, I'll never forget this, we called the election, it was pretty obvious we were going to win, but you're never complacent and you worry about it. BBC 6 o'clock news that night, John Sopel, they announced they were going to have every day during the campaign, they were going to have a 5-minute political special report. Okay? Oh, that's interesting, I thought. Tonight, we're starting with the first report on apathy. That was the first report on the BBC, the special report. We're going to have a report on apathy. And it's like, you know, that's quite a difficult thing to be up against. And they're only doing it because the papers are saying it. That's my big... I have big respect for the BBC in lots of ways. The thing I really don't like about the BBC is they allow their agenda to be set by the papers.
Question over here.
Your observations on female politicians like Merkel, Clinton, Clark, their relationships with the media. What challenges, what opportunities?
Thatcher?
Sorry?
Thatcher?
Oh, yes, as well.
No, the reason why, because I think she changes the argument a little bit. I mean, my daughter, she's 19, she's got this real thing about Thatcher. She's a woman prime minister, and her analysis as a sort of, young, she would see herself as the, young new wave of feminism, is that Mrs. Thatcher kind of set the cause of women in politics back. And I don't know if that's right or that's wrong. But I think Mrs. Thatcher, insofar as she had an approach with the media, it was very traditional. I think Merkel, Hillary, Helen Clark are much nearer to... I mean, I think I would put Thatcher in a completely different category, and those three, I think, are... I don't know whether they're given more leeway. I just don't know, but I think they're better communicators for being less obviously communicating the whole time. This is what I see as Cameron's weakness, and I think it's a bit of Obama's weakness as well. Is they always look the same. And they've obviously thought about it. I don't even know, for example, Obama, even if he's opening a school, he's got those, what do you call them, windscreen wiper things there. Whereas I think what you get, the only communication that works in the modern age is authenticity, I think. And I think I get the feeling the three you mentioned kind of it's pretty real. I mean, there's obviously a little bit of planning and they think through and they poll and all that stuff, but I think you can't operate at the top level unless you're actually being true to yourself.
Question over here.
Well, so I'm glad you've got to the BBC. But I mean, the question was how actually in all of this discussion, I don't see how you can discuss it without the BBC being at the centre of it. You talk about rebuilding trust and faith in politics, how you create jobs for journalists. The BBC is probably the only place that has journalists. Yet, the discourse you talked about, the discourse in the media about you talk about dominance of blocks of ownership. The only discourse about dominance of the media at the moment is the BBC's too big and needs to be cut down. So how do you, Theresa May, for example, but the press as well. So how do you integrate the conversations that are coming out of the hacked off Leveson and everything with the BBC in a way which actually has a proper discussion about the BBC and the size of the BBC's journalism and what it should be doing, and 6 million people still watching.
Yeah. BBC, I think that's a very interesting example of where the debate is actually not a real one. It's operating at the level of vested interest. So, for example, newspapers, the Murdoch papers, have a vested interest in undermining the BBC. The Mail hates anything that doesn't fit Paul Dacre's rather bizarre worldview, and that includes the BBC because it's a publicly funded entity and therefore he hates it. So there's a strong weight of opinion that is constantly just trying to sort of run down and negativise the BBC. But back to my point about what in this case an institution can take, it can take a hell of a lot, providing the institution is strong and doesn't cave and pander to that. So I think that the BBC, to my mind, over the last couple of decades, hasn't done a good enough job at actually explaining its cultural benefits. And sometimes it's just seemed to be almost taking them for granted. And that's when you get into difficulty. So I think an organisation as big and important as the BBC should constantly be emphasising its cultural value and its cultural worth. in the face of, like a lot of big institutions, a pretty vicious campaign of negativisation. But I think the BBC is a very, very good example of you can withstand all sorts of negativity provided your basic product and your basic reputation is good.
Natalie, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I do think the BBC is absolutely crucial in all of the discussions, and the Enders analysis actually shows that how they think that the BBC will become increasingly important in an ever more converged world, because actually in a world of media abundance, people go to places where they trust more. And why do they trust the BBC more? Because actually it does have good systems of accountability. And we see those kick into play very quickly when they mess up. And of course they will mess up. Journalism has to have the right to get things wrong as well. That's really important. But actually you need systems that can deal with that. And I think they do that incredibly well. I also think, though, that they need to stand up for themselves a bit more, and they need to develop a bit more balls, actually, because otherwise they will start to kind of really disintegrate that trust a little bit, because they will seem to be kowtowing to the politicians and all those who, because then all they ever do is come out and criticise the BBC. If they actually endlessly, sorry, really sorry, why not say, actually, you know what, this is what journalism should be doing. This is what we should be doing. This is what we did. This is why we did it. So a bit more explanation. In terms of concentration and landscape, the view we've taken within the Media Reform Coalition is that they should actually be part of the calculation, but not part of the remedy. And that's really important.
And also on those polling figures that Aaron read out, I think the reason why the journalists aren't lower is actually because, let's be frank about this, most people's sort of experience of what a journalist is probably watching Hugh Edwards. And, you know, that's somebody actually most people would say, yeah, I quite trust them. Even the people whose names we would all know because we've followed all this, or you know, the trial going on or whatever, even now, most members of the public, they might know Rebecca Brooks' name, they might now know Andy Coulson, but most of the guys who've written the stories that we're talking about, they wouldn't have a clue who you're talking about.
Yeah. But you're right, that's how it will be distorted. So when we do get on to talking about concentration and plurality, that's precisely the way the discourse, you know, the narrative will be pushed, and well, that means the BBC then. Let's cut that down to size.
My only comment, obviously completely agree with everything that everybody said, because that's what the BBC does on both sides. But you know,
well, that's rubbish.
but you know, just the caution is that of course the discourse is very difficult. When, for example, Mark Thompson signed the letter calling for News International's bid for B-Sky B, called in, that is why they continue to this day to sort of go for him, you know, with a personal vendetta. That's a deliberate.
And my point is, if somebody goes out and says that, and says it again, and says it again, eventually the public kind of understand that, and they probably have an instinctive understanding of that anyway. Where I disagree with Natalie a little bit is I don't think the BBC is very good at putting its hands up. Now I have one very, very high profile example of that.
That's part of the problem.
No, I don't agree actually. I think one of the most frustrating things I found working in Number 10 was actually getting any sense of engagement with the BBC about their own output at all. And what they did was kind of what I'm suggesting you do in relation to something like Mark Thompson, constantly say this line, he was never off the phone, complained about every bulletin, blah, blah, hardly ever complained about the BBC compared to, say, some of the other media organisations. But when you did, it was very, very difficult to get anything other than they sort of just try and drown you in the bureaucracy and I'll get back to you and we'll see and the rest of it. Very hard organisation to complain to, I found.
Whereas I've had a completely different experience with Hat Top, where we have complained to them as well about representation, and we've got a very proper hearing, whereas, you know, we put it into the PCC and you know,
the PCC
20 complaints are held out of 17,000.
Question in the back, go ahead.
With the emergence of the Jet Elton debate, the TV debate, and the increasing importance of Twitter and the internet as a whole, do you believe that now the charisma of the leaders is more important than ever before?
I think it might be, but I don't know. I mean, look, if you were a complete dud, if you were somebody who... I mean, I've often wondered, for example, when you see some of those old Churchill speeches, I mean, he was a great politician, a great leader, but can you imagine the British public today going for that? I'm not sure you could. And likewise, Attlee, again, there's not that much film survived, but I mean, I'm not so sure. So I think that they were, I guess the worry with charisma is where the charisma is not backed up by real substance. I think we have a kind of democratic deficit problem. I trust our system enough to think that somebody can get through without having what is seen as traditional charisma. Now, I can't think of any examples of that. Most recently, Tony, you'd have to say, had a lot of charisma. Gordon lost the election. Flowers, he's charismatic, yeah, very charismatic chap. But you know, if you look at Hollande won against Sarkozy.
Maria Miller.
What? Maria Miller. Sarkozy was a traditionally modern, charismatic leader. Hollande less so. I think, and also the point about social media, again, could be wishful thinking. I think social media is not just about what you can say in 140 characters about somebody. It's whether that person can communicate something of substance that millions and millions and millions of people will recognise. Now, I'm living in hope. I'm living in hope.
Alistair, I'm going to abuse my position.
I have to answer Aaron's final question.
Well, I was going to bring you back to Aaron for just a minute, so, and then you can answer his final question. But I want to come back to some of the other issues he was raising. One of the many reasons we invited you is because you have a foot in both camps, a foot in media journalism and a foot in politics. And you know, in these great lectures that you've given us, I mean, you put your critical eye very much on the world of journalism. And it's a very sharp critical eye, and I think many of us agree with so many of the things that you've said. You've put it really, really well. But what you haven't done so much is focused a critical eye on the other world that you are very familiar with, the world of politics. Mm-hmm. And some people might say, and this was a little bit the gist of some of Aaron's questions to you, that part of the, you know, insofar as there is any crisis of trust in politics, that it may owe itself a little bit to what politicians themselves and those in politics have done.
Yeah.
And so the blame lies not just on the journalists for being bad journalists and being preoccupied with celebrity, but also on those in politics mishandling their relations with the public and with the media. And I wonder if we could just invite you to spend a few minutes reflecting on that part of your life. That is, do you think that politicians and those who work for politicians as their advisors bear some responsibility for the skepticism, the lack of trust that many people feel about politics today? And to put it more bluntly, when you look at what you did in your time in politics, is there anything that you regret in that sense, that you think, well, actually, maybe that didn't really help? Maybe that actually contributed to the problem that we face. So I just wanted to, Aaron was putting these questions to you, and I just wanted to sort of encourage you to reflect a little bit more on that and maybe say what you feel able to say about that. The short answer to your question about me is no. And the reason for that doesn't mean there aren't lots and lots of things over the millions of words that I said in briefings, transcripts of which allegedly somewhere still exist, that I couldn't say, could have handled that a bit differently. But I think if I'm being frank with you, I'd be talking on the margins. Because I always like to think, and this is why I think this partly answers the question about politics and politicians. I like to think that the only effective communication is strategic communication. In fact, it's not that I like to think that, I strongly believe that. And that the reason why there is considerable disinterest, disillusion, is in part because people have a sense that they don't really know, this is Cameron's weakness, they don't really know what he's all about. They don't really have a sense of what he's trying to do with the country and where he's trying to take it and why. And I think that if I have a big criticism of politics, is that it's allowed itself to be tacticalized by 24/7 media, whose job necessarily is tactical, in that what media organisations are doing is their job is to kind of cover the here and now and to
you know, you see this particularly on 24/7 news. I mean, I reflected on this in the Q&A last week, that the news used to be a kind of event. You know, you turn on the telly, you have to press a button, you have to switch a thing, you go like that to get the right channel, it comes on and it's on for 28 minutes and that's it. And now the news happens all the time. We never ever get away from it. And most of the public aren't in that bubble, but the media who are inside that bubble, they have, one of the things that makes them journalists is a very, very short attention span. And they move on very, very quickly. The desire for whoosh breaking news is very, very strong. And that is their job. And I think sometimes the political class has got too much into thinking, and I was part of this, you have to be across every little surf of that. And in fact, what I've decided after 10 years on either side, and then a sort of weird hybrid since, is you don't need to be across it, you need to be constantly strategic. And that's what most politicians are not. So is that when a top politician, you see, I remember when Tony Blair was first sort of, you know, reasonably high profile, and he went over to Millbank, where all the kind of broadcasters are based, and he was doing a down-the-line interview with Tyne Tees Television. And the guy he got his earpiece fixed in, and he's sitting there in front of the camera, and the guy in the gallery up in Newcastle said, right, we're going to come to you in a minute, Mr. Blair. Can you just give me, so I can tell the interview, can you just give me a flavour of what you'll be saying? And Tony says, well, I've got 5 points I want to make. And the guy said, well, you better be quick because you can have 48 seconds. Now, it was a clip, okay? That's all they wanted. Do you remember when Ed Miliband got that terrible thing that they... do you remember when he said the same thing like 9 times and they played the whole interview? That was a total stitch-up because he was told he was pre-recording it for a clip. Now, if you're professionalisation, if you're told you're going to be on the news bulletin for one clip, why shouldn't you, the politician, be allowed to decide the content of that clip? Why should that interviewer decide that actually it's his job to get you to say something you don't want to say? So Ed said the same thing. I don't know if people saw this. He said the same thing again and again and again and again. Exactly the same words. Now, and people thought they were talking, you know, when they showed it, look at us, aren't we clever, aren't we funny? I think it was ITV, and of course they made him look like an idiot. Well, fair enough, they want to make him look like an idiot, they can do that. But my point is, he's entitled, the politician is entitled to control what comes out of his mouth. And so I think that back to my central point here, this is only going to change if both sides understand that neither really gains from the way the debate is now. Media saying politicians are all evil, or you know, Jeremy Paxman denies ever having said it, but the thing that he's reported to have said is that whenever he's being interviewed by a politician, he's going through his mind is, why is this liar lying to me? If that's the mindset, is it lying bastard? Sorry, yeah, well I didn't want to say that. So unless you have the media thinking actually there might be some purpose in democratic politics, and the democratic political world thinking, well actually the media does have a purpose in a modern democracy, I think we're slightly going to hell in a handcart. So I think, yes, of course, politicians and their aides have to bear some responsibility, but what I think the media always want to do with us is say, well, it's 6 of one, half a dozen the other. I think it's about 10-2. Yeah.
You have to answer
the fight. Well, I'm very pleased that so few of you knew that I'd had a fight with Michael White. It was on the day that Robert Maxwell died, and it's routinely written up as me coming to the defence of a man I loved. Anybody who ever worked for Robert Maxwell didn't love him, they worked for him. And I talked a little bit about owners last week. But what happened was, I think something, I like Mike a lot, he's a really good guy, but something weird does happen to people when big media events happen. And that was quite a big media event. Robert Maxwell dropping off the end of a boat somewhere in the middle of the whatever sea it was quite a big media event. I was political editor of the Daily Mirror, and so therefore my phone was going quite a lot. I was also having to write the story down at our little cubbyhole office in the House of Commons, and Mike White kept running into the office and doing this, what he thought very funny joke, going Bob, 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 right? So, which is funnier now than it was, and what's more, I had my staff who were all kind of thinking, what's going to happen to us, and we've got a job, and is the paper going to survive, and all that sort of stuff, and we're having to get all these tributes, and blah, 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 blah. So I sort of smiled the first time, Then he was running off down the corridor. Then he came back and went in, bop, 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 bop. And I said, oh my God, give it a break. Anyway, about 5 times later, I'm afraid, as used to happen in Cambridge a lot when I was here, the red mist descended and I threw, this is the answer to your question, I threw a rather feeble punch. It drew a little bit of blood. He then retaliated, and then David Hill, Labour Party, and Ian Aitken, Guardian elder statesman, appeared and split us up. So it wasn't a proper fight at all. However, just shows you the really sharp. I've never forgotten this. I did think, shit, I'm going to be in trouble for this. It's one of those things that was going to get out. I did actually get called up before the Sergeant at Arms, which is not a pleasant experience if you sort of don't like the establishment very much. So I thought, I've got to get to the office. And I went to the lift, and who should be in the lift but Simon Walters, then of The Sun, now of the Mail on Sunday, who is quite an effective sort of wheedler-outer of. And what I didn't realise, as I'm sort of, just saying this, is that he was taping the whole thing, and it was all over the papers the next day. And so I'd say it was a very ignoble draw.
That's a good point.
But Alistair, do you not remember that on that day when that was your editor at Malloy was...
No, it's Roy Greenslade, I think.
You sure? Well, the editor was interviewed by the BBC saying, when did you last speak to Mr. Maxwell? And he said, well, I spoke to him on the phone this morning. And the guy said, well, how did he sound? He said he was in a very buoyant mood.